Tech Meetup. If you could kind of spread around the room just so we can all see each other, that would be great. So, I guess what we, out of curiosity, if you're here for the first time, could you raise your hand, please? Right, right. Okay, welcome everyone. Hope you come back to the next one as well. Um, so, um, this event is made possible by our sponsors, who are Skyscanner and Cultivate and Informatics Ventures. What Tech Meetup is like a meetup for people interested in technology. You don't have to work with technology, as long as you've got the slightest interest in it. You're more than welcome. Um, I know that some people don't necessarily like the introductions that we're gonna do. Like, it's fine if you say I'm here for the beer and pizza, and just move on to the next person. Um, so tonight we're gonna have two talks, usual. I guess a bit of admin before we start. So toilets are just across the hallway there. The fire exit, I think, yeah, fire exit's there, and I think in the back. There shouldn't be any fire alarms going, no tests that I'm aware of. So, yeah, if it does happen to go off, yeah, cold. So this is why I'm rambling a bit more than usual. So I guess to start things off, what we're going to do is just go around the room. Everyone can like say their name and kind of what brings them here, and after that we can start the talk. So I'll go first. Hi everyone, my name is Marius. I'm an iOS developer, and I help organize Tech Meetup. first talk that Rachel's going to give. Uh, Again, like this event is made possible by our sponsors, Skyscanner, Cultivating Informative Ventures. See everyone back here in 10 minutes. Do you wanna see if it works? If you press Right, everyone, if I can have your attention, please. We're going to start the first talk of the evening. If you can all have a seat, please. Right, so for the first talk of the evening, we've got Rachel talking to us about DevOps. Take it away.
So, good evening. I gave this talk about a week and a half ago at the DevOps Day in Edinburgh. And just before I went on the stage, one of the people I worked with, we were having coffee upstairs before the thing started. And he went, "Rachel, you sound awful." I thought, great, thanks, mate. So, my cold is coming back. I'm hoping my voice is going to hold out, but it is going to get lower and lower by the time I finish. So please bear with me. Before I actually start my proper talk, I want to just reiterate the thing about the lightning talks and why you should do them, because it's from doing things like lightning talks that I started doing talks properly, and now I get invited to do keynote talks in conferences like DevOps Days and DjangoCon and all of that. Do a talk, even if you don't think you've got anything to say that anybody wants to listen to, because first, you do. Secondly, you need to practice the thing of doing a talk. Like, I turned up this evening, this wasn't actually quite working, we needed to work out how to get the AV to work. The reason I'm comfortable with the fact that was all going wrong was I've done it before. So do a lightning talk, work out what it's like to turn up with an iPad or a laptop, figure out how to make it work. It's really good experience. The better the experience, the more you get, the better it is. Okay, that's the end of my preamble. And I've now tested that the microphone works. Do you see what I just did there? So this is the start of my talk. DevOps. Why the CEO should care, and how to convince them with numbers. So this is me. I'm currently a freelance DevOps consultant. As of right now, I'm an unemployed freelance DevOps consultant, but that's fine, because in 10 days' time I shall be back at the Scottish Government. Yay! I have been many things in my life. I have been working through the most interesting part of the computing times. When I started, it was mainframes in a back room which had to be kept at particular temperature because the minis and the mainframes wouldn't work otherwise. Now we've got cloud. It's just been an utterly amazing experience. I am, as I said, sir, I'm currently an infrastructure engineer at the Scottish Government. I have spent 3 decades programming the internet, which is longer than most of you have been alive. So I do think I know a little bit about how it works and how it's changed. I've been an engineering manager, I've been a network programmer, I'm a full stack engineer. Quite a lot of those things are different job titles for doing the same thing I'm doing now. When I was a systems engineer, I basically was doing DevOps. Engineer 10 years ago, yeah, I was doing DevOps. It's the same word put on the same job, a different word put on the same job. I have had almost a quarter of a century experience of working for myself. It was 1995 when I last left my last permanent job. it's quite good fun working for yourself because you get to make what the rules are to an extent. I've worked for some really good companies like the BBC, Elsevier, FTSE 100 company, and Nominet, who are the DNS registrar in the UK, if you don't know who they are. And indirectly, I worked on a project for Skype. But the bit that's relevant for this talk is I spent 8 years as a startup CEO. So that's why I think I know about why DevOps should matter to a startup CEO. So I started this company in 1995, which is when I left my last proper job. I had this, at the time, we were on Netscape 2, I think it was. The internet had just become a public utility that anybody could pay 10 quid to Daemon and get online with. And I had this amazing idea that I would be able to start a company that would make money, because if I could make money then, when would I? Well, here's the thing. I didn't make money. But I did make a company which had fantastic staff. We had a brilliant idea. It was digital cash. You might have heard of that. Basically, a great idea, but 20 years too early. Got investors, got a great team of individuals in my staff. I had directors, I had investors, did the whole thing right, except for the fact it was too early. We didn't make any money. But that photo there, I make sure I put that in every presentation I do, because I like that photo. That was me. And if you're thinking it doesn't look much like me now, I have to tell you, it didn't look much like me then. To the point, I took that magazine home and I showed my dad, saying, "Dad, what do you think of that?" Because my mum had just died. We needed cheering up. What do you think of that? And he goes, "What?" I go, "That." "What?" Okay, "It's me." He still didn't recognise me. So, that was me once. This is me now. Anyway, startups. Let's talk about startups. What is a startup? You can actually have a startup inside of a large government organisation. You can have it inside of a organisation like the BBC. You can have it inside of any kind of enterprise. If you believe in this definition, which was it was a guy called Steve Blank, who is quite famous in the startup world. A startup is an organisation formed to search for a repeatable and a scalable business model. Basically, you don't know what you're doing, and you're trying to work it out. That's what a startup is. Because the point you want to get to is but you're aiming to get to where you do. And that when you do, that's the point in which you can start scaling it, you can start growing it, you can start making money from it. But to start with, you know that you don't know what you're doing. The bit I worked in the BBC, the Forge project, this was a classic definition of a startup, because we needed to figure out how to make the low-level networking stuff that every individual part of the BBC was writing for themselves, the news, the identity, the powers that be figured out they needed to have one place in the BBC where this was done, so there'd be one way of doing it, not 15. So we basically got employed as a bunch of contractors to go in as a skunkworks team. I'm going to move through some of these slides because these were more, some of these are more relevant to the talk, the DevOps Days talk than maybe a general thing here. But I'm going to give you an overview of what startup culture has been. Back 10 years ago, these guys, Steve Black and the guy that wrote the Lean Startup book, came up with this amazing concept. The reason why companies fail, it's not because they don't write fantastic tech. It's not because they don't have an amazing team. It's because they don't actually know how to get customers. And it sounds, when you say that that's really quite an obvious thing. But if you've ever worked in a startup, including mine, you'll know that that's the reason why the company fails. You don't have any customers, so you don't have the income, you don't have the revenue, you don't know what you're doing wrong because you haven't got customers telling you because you haven't got customers. So they came up with this idea of lack of customers. We have processes to develop product. We've got really good processes now. We start off with waterfall. We've now, some of us got agile. These are things that we're learning how to do as a software industry. But 10 years ago, we didn't have processes for developing customer. That's where Lean Startup came from. So if anybody is familiar with it, is the idea of run a repeatable experiment really quickly. You need to either succeed or fail. The failures are where you find out what you're doing wrong and what you change. And if you keep doing that fast enough, you eventually get to the point, if you're doing it right, you have got a repeatable, scalable business model. That's the whole point of a startup, is you're trying to look for that. These 4 things: customer discovery, customer validation, creation, and then building the company. Only the 2 bits are relevant to what I'm talking about: customer discovery and customer validation. These are the things where you figure out these fundamental truths, which if you're in a startup and you haven't got this bit right, there is no chance you're going to succeed. The customer has a problem. Lots of people have lots of problems. The important bit is that they are willing to spend money to solve. Because if you solve a problem that they don't care about enough to spend money with you, you do not have a business. Was that applause? Yeah. That feels like the ghost of my dead company. Hypothesis 2. You can solve that problem for a price that's less than they're willing to pay. Unless you're Amazon and you're willing to put loads of money into every shipment loses them money at the early days. You actually need to figure out how you solve the problem that they are willing to pay money for at a price that is less than they are willing to pay. Otherwise, you make no money. So that's customer development. It all sounds so obvious. But the whole point of what I'm trying to say here is that to make your company succeed, you have to iterate. And you have to just try things really, really fast. The more things you can try, the faster you can say, does this work, does this not work? That's how you find out whether you're going in the right direction or not. So I've got a slide here. It's not particularly clear, but the point here of this slide, you've got three graphs. You've got the lovely one that goes, woo, that's your Skyscanner, your Facebook, Adhesive. You've got the one that goes, eee. That was your Intertrader, my company. And then you've got the one that's in the middle where it just sort of goes, you start and you get to a steady state. Which, if it's your money you're spending to develop that company, that actually might be where you want to go. That's a nice, what they call a lifestyle company. You've grown something that is a good lifestyle. So that might work for you as the founders, but if you've got investor money in, as I had in my company, they don't want that, because that means they have to put management time into just keep finding out what you're doing, and it's not actually doing anything. You're happy, but they're not, because they want you to either succeed or tank. So the faster you can find out which of those two you're doing, the more efficiently you can spend the investor money, and the happier they will be with you. And it might not be true over here, I'm not sure about it, but back in Silicon Valley, the culture and the ethos is, if you fail, and you fail in a way that's good, we'll give you more money, because next time you'll know more. So next time you'll do a better startup iteration. Anyway, that whole preamble is why the startup CEO should care about DevOps. Because actually, I'm not talking to a DevOps Day audience here. Does anybody know what I mean by DevOps? Yeah, 1 person, 2 people. Okay. It's what I used to call network programming, sysadmin, all that stuff that puts it in front of the paying audience. It's a bit more than that, but in basic, it's the bit between the developer and the customer. And the reason why people should care about DevOps in a startup thing is you want to do that iteration as fast as you possibly can, because that's how you learn, and that's to become a good startup. And I'm going to have a little intermission here. We're going to talk about what is DevOps. So I put out on various social networks and things in a DevOps audience, what do you think it is? What does your boss think it is? And what are people actually doing in your company and sticking that DevOps label on it? So, interesting answers. Well, I thought they were. If you have DevOps in your company, you might like to think about what your answers are and tell me afterwards, because I always want more grist to this mill. Lots of long phrases here. Programmatic configuration of infrastructure. Yep, that's part of it. Yep, I agree with that. Removing silos. That sounds good. Making sure that code in production stays live and deploying to production is painless. Yeah, that sounds really good. And other quotes with long words. The one I thought was most realistic Because every time I talk to somebody who knows what they're talking about, they tell me something different. Okay, what do you manage to think it is? If it's cloud, it's DevOps. If ops team that have learned how to code, yeah, that could be. Two stressed people trying to keep an app online. That sounds very realistic. What does your company do and call it DevOps? Well, all loads of things. I like the last one. They're doing traditional ops, but they're deploying software with Puppet. I've just spent the last month doing Puppet, so yeah, it wasn't from there. None of these quotes are from where I'm currently working. But this is my personal favourite. This might resonate with some of us in the room. Trying to avoid the machine police. As in, you don't have to have somebody telling you whether you can deploy or not. You can just put that damn machine up without having to go through the rigmarole of making somebody give you a machine that you can play with. Now, what is DevOps? This is my answer. As I say, I've been doing what I consider DevOps since before it got that label put on it. And I've been a startup CEO. So this may or may not work for you, but in my head, this is what DevOps is. The use of people, processes, and tools to achieve frictionless delivery of customer value. Because if you don't have customer value, what is the point of your business? The whole point of what you're doing as a business is to deliver stuff. The more friction you put in to that process, like the machine police, the harder it is to get that customer value that you've got in the development team in front of the customer. But it's not just tools. People think it's, oh, I write a bit of Ansible, or I do Puppet, or I've automated something. That's part of it, but that's not what DevOps is. It's the combination. It's the people, the processes, and the tools. So, Jeff Atwood, you may have heard of him. He founded Stack Overflow. Does anybody here not use Stack Overflow to do their day-to-day job? Oh, okay. There's always one. But this is a brilliant quote. I'm pointing there, but I should be pointing there. How long does it take for you to put a one-word or one-character change into your website or your front-end interface? We had a couple of we had a really good talk about 2 years ago from Alistair Han, who was CTO of Skyscanner at the time, talking about how they were trying to push it from. It took them a long time to start with, and he was trying to get it to every single code commit that you put in would get to production if it was good enough, if it had gone through the gates of the testing and all of this. It's a really good talk. It's available on the YouTube channel because we record these talks. If you want that link, let me know. I can forward it. But that's what they were trying to go through. Every single code commit that had been put in to the production branch would get in front of the customer, because that meant they could iterate really fast. And for those of you who don't know who Skyscanner are, they started at 3 people ran a kitchen table, and then he sold for $2 billion. I think they got it right. So, how long would it take in your organization to put a one-word change in your primary product? So, I have a side project. I thought there was a slide for this, which is loves me. It's been my side project for about 10 years. It was going to look fantastic, and I was going to mention you because you're the one that made it look good. I made it work, but my intern, she made it look absolutely fantastic. Anyway, my site is still running at the moment. If I put a one-word change into something on the front page, it will be 15 minutes from me committing it to the right branch to it being live. It's like 15 seconds to make that one-word change. When I deploy it into my Jenkins server, it goes through the process. I use Docker Swarm, if you've heard of that, which is Docker, but at scale and for systems. So if I say, you've got this version running, I want that version running, and that version is then applied to the Docker server, it will just push it out. If that fails, you've still got the original, because it doesn't actually close it down. It just keeps running with the old one until the new one's running. It's really, really good. So 15 minutes, any change I make, it's up there. And actually, 15 seconds of that was me doing anything other than going and making a cup of tea and seeing, did it work? Did it work? Final part of my talk. how to convince the boss with numbers. Because this is a problem that I have seen in many places I've worked. So I've been working a long time, as you can tell from my grey hair. And I'm a contractor. So I've seen the insides of lots of different teams and lots of different companies. And what I have seen over and over again is that thing where the technical people know that what they want to do makes sense. They know it's right, and the boss still says no. I don't know if that resonates with anybody in the room, but it's like, why don't they just know I'm right? Why don't they just listen to me? I've got senior in my job title, for God's sake. Why don't they just do what I say? Well, so I've tried to make those arguments. They don't work. I'm going to give you a scenario here. Originally, when I planned this talk, I was going to give lots of them, but because I've been ill the week before I gave the talk, I'd finished writing this at midnight the night before I was supposed to deliver it at 9 o'clock, and I decided the time had come to stop. So I'm going to give you one example, which is this. Oh, okay. That's slightly unexpected. 4 pillars of DevOps. This is what DevOps is all about: culture, automation, measurement, and sharing. 2 I care about: automation and measurement. These are the easy bits. To make DevOps work properly, culture is the most important bit, but it's really hard. It's really hard to get it right. But you can't do what we now think of as DevOps as a way of working without having the culture right. Sharing is part of that. These things matter, but you can't measure them particularly well, and they're really hard. So the easy wins when you're putting DevOps in is the automation and the measurement. So those are the 2 bits I'm talking about. Where to start? You need to find a bottleneck. If you don't have any of this DevOps culture in your business or your project at the moment, find something that's really simple. Because where it goes wrong is a company says, do you know, we've heard of DevOps, it's really good. We should be doing this. We'll hire a consultant and a team. And in the meantime, everybody else just keep working. And then the consultant and the team will go, we're going to change everything you do, because that's the way we're going to get the big win. Well, that doesn't work. Anybody that's worked in a team where you have this like tsunami effect of change everything all at the same time, whilst delivering at the same speed that you did before the consultants came in, don't do that. It doesn't work. But if you can find one small thing and go, well, this is the direction we want to go. This is where we're trying to get to. One small thing. What is the bottleneck that's stopping us delivering customer value right now? What can we do? And it might be as simple as saying, well, we've got this guy over here who used to source the old machines when we had to run our own machines now. Well, now we can go to cloud. Okay, don't go to cloud overnight. Find one little server that you can move over so you can start to learn. Find a bottleneck, find a metric why it matters. Do something, measure it. And work out how much effort is to move the needle in one thing. Because even if you're trying to do something really small, as Jeff Atwood's quote would say, in some companies, just changing one word is a huge amount of effort. So don't try and fix all of that at one time. Find one bit of it that's a problem that really matters. And usually what I've seen is that the changes that matter are where delivery of developer effort is going to production. Now, in my system, I am the developer. I am the ops team. And I've got a full-time job. So actually, I want to spend no time at all on my side project at the moment. I just don't have that time to spend. When I've been working with the companies I work with, we're trying to deliver customer value. We're trying to make changes that matter. In some cases, because the company will die if we do not succeed in this mission. In other cases, the company or the government or whatever will keep going, but we're not delivering what we can do. So find one thing. Find a metric. Because you need the metric, because you need to be able to prove that you've made a difference. Measure it, move it. And the really key thing I learned was in one of the companies I work with. When we talk as developers about what we care about, we're not using management language. So the managers don't understand what we're talking about. Because what they're hearing is us going, yeah, TLA, and they're going, hey, we need more, or less, or whatever. We need to talk their language. And if you can use business KPIs rather than development KPIs, you can make a much more compelling argument. So, KPI, thank you. Actually, I don't actually know anymore. Key performance indicator, or something. The thing that people measure. Thanks, Stuart. I'm going to give you an example. Got bottleneck. So in my imaginary company, this is totally made up as an example for the talk. But the example is one of a bottleneck that quite a lot of us have probably dealt with. In my example startup company, you have what could be a potentially profitable, successful company. But it's a company where you're dealing with enterprise. So once you've got them, you're going to get a lot of money from them. But to get them started, it's an awful lot of work. In my example here, every time you get a new customer, you have to put out a complete new system for them. Every new customer needs a complete new configuration and a complete new build. And there is only one member of the team that knows how to do it. And that has been the case in more companies that I have worked in than I would like to think about. In fact, I had a very interesting job once when I got hired in as a freelancer consultant. The guy who knew what they were doing was leaving. So basically they had 2 weeks to take his knowledge and document it. And I got hired to do that. It was great because I basically he was leaving on good terms. He wanted to help, but he was leaving. So 2 weeks to get the one person who knew everything. Get that knowledge, let's stick it down on paper. Right, so in my example, Joe is this person. He knows everything. Nobody else knows. They're all technically good, but they're doing different things. He is the one person who has to do the build. It takes him 1 day. And in this day and age, that might sound a long time. I know companies where this is still true. For the one person has to take the software from here, the data from there. They have to fire up something over there. They have to munge it all together. Out at the end, if they're lucky, it's taken 1 day. So the technical result of this is you can only onboard 1 new customer a day. Unless Joe's on holiday, ill, on honeymoon, whatever. And if they are, you can't do anything. So the other impact is that Joe is really pissed off with this because she wants to do something different. She does not want to keep doing these damn builds. But she can't actually spend time to automate anything because we have to get the build done. We have to get the build done. She's leaving. The business consequence looks totally different. I mean, it's still bad, but it's far, far worse. Because the business consequences, in my mythical example, you've got a sales director. He's fired up 25 new customers. If you can get those customers on board, and it's the last week of the quarter, because quarters matters when you've got investment money. If you could just turn those signed up customers who want to spend money with you into deliverable money on the bottom line, your company's solvent. If you can't, you've missed the targets. And in this example, because Joe's the only person who can do it, and it takes a day each time, you can only get 5. So rather than getting 25 new customers on board and that revenue, you've got 5. Now, depending on the company, missing the quarterly target like that, in my example, is a difference between the bank calling in the bank loan. It might mean nothing at all. It might just mean, oh, that's a bad board meeting we're going to have. Oh, my God. But it can be absolutely catastrophic. Because if you've got other people's money in your business, then they have set targets. And if you don't meet them, there are consequences. So if you miss your quarterly targets and your company goes bust because Joe couldn't automate it, how much was that worth? Probably it was worth buying in another contract or employee or putting somebody else on that job. So how you could phrase it, rather than going, I'm a senior developer and I know what I'm talking about, give me the time. No. You could phrase it like this. If you knew the background to the business, if you were in that business and you understood it, you don't just go, listen to me, I know what I'm talking about. Just give me the goddamn time to do what you know I need to do. You could say this. We can 10x the rate at which we bring on customers. We've got to get the knowledge out of Joe's head. It's going to cost this in delayed revenue because Joe will not be doing this whilst we do this piece of remedial work. Once we've done it, we'll make that money back in a week or two. And after that, we're going to be this much more profitable. So I think about things differently than quite a lot of developers that I know, because not only am I a business entrepreneur, I've tried doing it myself. I've got a diploma in accounting and finance. I've been a manager. I've seen these numbers, and I've had the consequences when it was my own company. Everybody who is a developer is capable of understanding it like this. If they care to look outside of the silo that they put themselves in of saying, I'm just a developer, a manager will tell me what to do. If you want to make a persuasive argument, this is my point. If you want to make a persuasive argument to somebody who does not understand the language you speak, frame it in their words, not yours. Unless you've already built up that trust network with them that means that they will listen to you because you are you. Now, for most of us, we don't start there. We start somewhere else. We build up to that. If you can learn to understand business language and business consequences, you can be much more persuasive, and that's how to convince them with numbers. So the point is, we need, as developers, to understand how to be treated as though we are not a cost. Because if you look in most businesses' business models, development, software, they think of us as a cost. We cost money. We do. Some of us a lot of money. It's part of what we do. But if the business relies on that software, that is actually the end product. What we need to learn how to do as an industry, I think, is learn how to convince the managers of numbers by talking in their language, which means letting them talk about us as an investment and not a cost. Because if you talk to a sales director and say, if I sell you this advert and we will prove within a week that every dollar you put in, you'll get $10 out in new sales, and here's the numbers of how I will show you that, they'll go, yeah, why wouldn't I do that? So 1 week in of the experiment, you'll have the consultant that sold them the SEO or the advertising or the whatever, a way of showing, here's the experiment, here's what we're trying to do, here's how we have the numbers to back up the message of what they're trying to sell. We don't do that as an industry. We just go, we need more, we need something. Give us the time, give us the budget, just let us do the thing we need to do. If we can learn to talk about it like this, like the numbers actually are part of our job, we've got a compelling argument. It's much harder to say you're wrong. So investment mindset, not cost. Thank you. That is the end of my talk. If you want my slides, there's a link there. If you want to hear a slightly more, less cold-driven version of it, the video from the DevOps Day is up on their website at the moment. And thank you very much. I am open to questions. Any questions? Yes.
Some of that sort of assumes that you were right if you're saying that you will show this within 2 weeks. So how much should you sell it as an experiment you would do to try and show an improvement, and how much should you say this is something that I know?
Okay, so the question, if people didn't hear it, is how much do you try to phrase this as in, it's an experiment, let's see if we're right, and how much do you say it as, I will prove that I am right? I think, well, it depends on your personality. I would go for the experiment, saying, this is what I'm asking you to risk. This is how long I'm asking it to take. And here is when we'll know whether we're right or not. Because it might be, you're nearly there, but you need to tweak it a bit. If you frame it as an experiment, say, but if we are right with this, here is the payoff. Here is the extra volume of traffic, customers, whatever. And here are the numbers that will show the metrics that matter, that will show whether that was a good experiment. Well, they're always good experiments, but did it actually show what you wanted? Because the thing about software and you're doing stuff you don't know how to do all the time. So how can you say you're right? You just say, I think this is the way to go. Let's find out. So it's people, processes, and tools. You can experiment with all of them, and you should, because sometimes you don't know whether this kind of meeting works better than that kind of meeting. Try it and see. You don't know whether the first thing is to identify where the bottleneck actually is, because in some companies I've worked in, everybody knows where the bottleneck is, but nobody talks about it because that's the way it's always been. And you need somebody to go, well, why don't we fix that? And it might be that it's a people problem. Maybe we need to take the knowledge out of Joe's head and write it down so that other people can do it. Maybe we need to have a process where we don't just do what we're asked all the time by everybody. We go, there's a gatekeeper. They decide whether we do this thing or not. Or it might be a tool. Maybe the tool we used to use only works with an old version of the operating system that we've got. We should maybe invest in upgrading. There are so many things that could be bottlenecks. It's a thing of identifying one and then trying stuff, but doing it fast. Because if you're, what I've seen in I'm going to tell you a story. Okay, my first ever contract, 1980 something or other. I worked on a project called CHOTS. This is when the government had so much money to throw around. They didn't know how to build an office automation system. So they built two. They had two competing consortium, both being given huge amount of money. I was working on one of them. And it was to say, we'll just figure out at the end of 5 years which one works best. And in that 5 years, you could actually buy an off-the-shelf one. But they didn't want to cancel either of them because invested stuff, bottleneck was like ridiculous. Like we couldn't move as fast as the outside world was moving, but there was too much ego involved and too much. So, yeah. Look up CHOTS. It's a fascinating horror story of how not to do software. CHOTS. That's an interesting question.
Right, thank you, Rachel. Right, so what we're going to do now is take a 15-minute break, and we're going to be back here for Andrew, where is he? Right there, to give the second talk. So 15 minutes, I'll meet up here. This is your chance to ask Rachel any questions that you had but didn't get a chance to ask. the start of the second talk of the evening. I guess while we're waiting for people to sit down, another reminder, lightning talks in December. Go and talk to Justin. He's over there. Yay. Right, so for the second talk of the evening, we're going to have Andrew talk to us about 12 things we wish you'd say. Let's see what that's about.
Thank you. Where's Rachel? Rachel. Before I begin, can you hear me okay? Before I begin, can we give Rachel another round of applause? As I mentioned to her at the break, it is almost like we were supposed to be paired together, because a lot of the things that I have to say follow on things that she said, and I was in the back typing away because she said things like, we need to talk their language. Devs need to learn about how to speak business. If you can understand business, you can convince them of things. You need to convince the management in your business using their language. And that's the sort of thing that I really wanted to talk about. And I'm on the Code Clan mailing list. And when I got the announcement that Tech Edinburgh was meeting up in Codebase, and they were looking for speakers, I sent Justin, where's Justin? I sent Justin an email with 2 ideas. And one of them was about contacting Toastmasters, or a public speaking organization, to get somebody to come in and talk about communication. As I mentioned at the intro, I'm a product owner, and my job basically all the time is to communicate between the business and between programmers. And it's a constant game of interpretation, not only because I originally was working between the UK and the US, and interpreting between those 2 languages was one task. And then business and dev was a whole different level. And then if you're talking about it's like a multi-dimensional chess match. And so I told Justin we really need to have somebody talk about communication. And he said, can we talk on the phone? And I said, sure. So we had a phone call, and he asked me why I thought this was an important topic. And it's something that I spent a lot of time thinking about. Originally, and Rachel probably knows about this study as well, it was that, at least in America, there have been numerous studies done that in things like engineering, 15% of your success is based on your technical ability, and 85% is your ability to deal with other people and to communicate with them. And I was also thinking about the fact that a lot of CEOs have a sales background. They're used to talking to customers. They might not be the most technologically advanced, but they know how to deal with people. Communication, especially in tech, is at the heart of everything we do. There's a reason that we call them languages. Developers communicate with computers, but they also have other people within the business that they have to communicate with. And so, and Rachel alluded to this numerous times, that it's important for developers to be able to speak business, because that's what you can control. You can control your ability as tech people to talk to the business, not make sure that they're able to speak tech. So I told him about that, and then I told him this story. I had an interesting experience back in 2012. It was as part of a startup, and so it was funny again that Rachel was talking about that. I was part of a social organization called Cash Mobs, and we didn't consider ourselves a startup, but we got a huge amount of attention in the States and internationally. I was interviewed by every major radio and television station. I was interviewed by a station in Argentina and Le Monde in Paris. And all these people, like around the world, people knew what we were doing. And these venture capitalists in San Francisco found out about it. And so one of them contacted me and said, we're going to have this dinner in San Francisco, and we'd really like you to come. And so I said, okay. He flew me out, put me up in a hotel. And the dinner was like, I showed up, and the two people in front of me that arrived at his house, we were the first 3 people to arrive. They turned around, and they were 2 of the guys that started Twitter. And over the course of the evening, the guys that had sold Instagram the week before for like, I think it was 1.5 billion or something like that, they were there. And the guy that started Foursquare. And everybody except for Mark Zuckerberg, the head of all these massive tech companies, show up to this dinner. And I'm sitting there just not knowing what's going on. And Mark Zuckerberg didn't show up because his then girlfriend or fiance was graduating from med school that night, and he couldn't make it. Otherwise, he would have been there as well. So the next day, the host, whose name was Tony Conrad, picked me up, and he said, "What did you think about the dinner last night?" And I turned to him and I just said, "I have no idea what kind of telephone any of those people own." And he just stopped at a red light and he looked over, he goes, "What do you mean?" And I was like, the guys from Twitter were not tweeting to each other. The guys from Instagram weren't taking pictures of the food. The guy from Foursquare wasn't checking in and rating things. Like, nobody was looking at their phone. They were all just sitting there and talking to each other. And he just looked at me and he said, "Yeah, but that's how business is done." And I was like, you understand that. You understand that communication is at the heart of everything you're doing at these multi-billion-dollar companies. But nobody else in the world, at every other dinner table, in every other restaurant in America right now, there's people that are sitting across the table from each other and not looking each other in the eye. They're looking at their phones. You understand that communication is important, but what you're doing is breaking that communication. I think Nicholas Nassim Taleb said, any communication that's not face-to-face, it's something like destroys your soul or something like that, or is injurious to your health. So Rachel reminded me of something else he said. He also said, "I'd rather put money into a bad idea with good people than a good idea with bad people." If you're going to be doing a business, starting business, it's better to be a good person that can communicate than anything else. Anyway, I told all this to Justin, and he said, "Well, why don't you talk about it? We can't get you in October, but we can get you in November." So that's why I'm here. It turned out that I was really passionate about this. The title of my talk, "The 12 Things That We Wish You'd Say." Originally, this was supposed to be sort of a letter from the product side of things to developers. But I really thought, actually, this extends to everybody in the tech community, because this is a community, and it's important that we all communicate to each other. So it's also, besides being a product person speaking to developers, it's also just sort of a attempt to get through to everybody how important this is for the collective success, all of our collective success. And I see this as something that it's not a zero-sum game. The more successful everybody in this room is in every facet, the more successful we all are as a group. So especially when we're looking at things like technology in Scotland versus technology in London versus Silicon Valley or Silicon Glen or whatever it is. To be a successful community, we need to communicate with each other. Now, there's a big elephant in the room of why the hell is this guy coming over from California to talk to us about communication? Who is he, and why does he have any right to talk about this? Besides the fact that I've spent so much time thinking about this and so much time interacting and interpreting between devs and business, I've been doing some form of communicating in public for the last 22 years. From student politics, I was a teacher, I was a lawyer for 5 years, again, founded a startup. I was a host and producer for NPR, which is a big public radio and media conglomerate in America. I was area governor of a Toastmasters. I've given a TEDx talk, I've done sales. So I've been doing this for a long time, and I feel like there are certain things that I've learned and certain things that Rachel reminded me of during her talk that I'm going to get into. So we care what you have to say because you're important. It's undeniable that the tech scene in Scotland is remaking everything that we're doing. So it's important for you to be able to talk to us. And there's also something that I was thinking about. Oftentimes, and I've run into this at both of the companies that I worked at. Developers oftentimes feel like what they have to say isn't important, and I'll be getting into that later, but it's important that you understand that what you have to say is important, especially for the success of businesses. And it's important that we hear from you what your thoughts are on what you're doing and what you want to do. And it's important that other people do as well. This tech meetup itself is an example of the importance of the cross-pollination of ideas. The fact that Rachel and I can get up here and talk, and then next month, at least 7 people are going to be giving 5-minute talks. That's where real ideas and new businesses and startups come from. So that's why I think it's important that everybody realize here that they have a voice. So it's counterintuitive, but the first thing that I would say we want to hear from you is nothing. And what I mean by that is one of the most important things that you can do when communicating is listening. Rachel mentioned of the 4, there were 4 aspects of getting a company right, I believe it was, and culture was the hardest. DevOps. And culture is the hardest to get right. There's an amazing book called The Culture Code by a guy named Daniel Coyle. He wrote the most important moments in conversation happen when one person is actively, intently listening. That's big. And it's something that a lot of times we spend too little time doing. One of the other things, he's done a lot of research into communication and the way that culture works. One of the biggest predictors of a good culture versus a bad culture is the number of interruptions in communication. And I see some nods out there. In bad cultures, people interrupt each other all the time. And in good cultures, you see a lot of people who listen to each other and pay attention and keep their eyes or their ears and their minds open to new ideas. So of the 12 things that we do want to hear from you, one of the most important things for communication is listening, being part of that, being the listening side of that communication. And it helps you learn, I think, and Rachel also mentioned the importance of listening to customers. It's almost like I'm just going to talk about things that I heard her say. But one of the things, there's that saying that the customer is always right. And it's been going around in my head for the last couple weeks because I don't think it means that the customer is right about everything. I think what the intent is that the customer gets to have their say with their money. And if it doesn't matter how right you are or how good your idea is, if they're not buying it, if you're not listening to what they have to say and they're not buying your product, it doesn't matter. You're not going to be in business. So listening to the customer is also really important. Justin asked for takeaways for each of the points that I made. So the takeaway from this point is that if you're doing anything, it might be difficult, but just try to listen more. Number 2, be vulnerable. And this, again, follows off of the culture code. Teams don't don't excel when they're all trying to be perfect. And as developers, one of the things that I've run into is that everybody's really, really, really smart in programming. They're really, really sharp. And even if they don't always get things right, they work hard enough so that they don't end up failing. And it's really hard for a lot of developers to admit that they don't get everything right all the time sometimes. So being vulnerable about that is one of the best ways as a group to build communication in between the members. This happened this morning because I messed up. And this is my vulnerability to you as a group. The product managers had given me a deadline in December for one of the releases. And I forgot to mention, I told my team, okay, we're going to be releasing on this date. And they scrambled and they got really nervous and scared and they were frustrated because it felt like there was this date looming on them to get their work done that they had no say over. But the delivery manager had told me that was the date because it was really important for her, that we help her out by getting it done. It wasn't that we had to release on this date. It was that we were doing this as a favor. So I got a lot of flack and backlash from the developers about this particular date. This morning, I remembered that I hadn't told them all of the facts. And I said, oh, by the way, the reason that we're doing it is this. We're just doing a really, really big favor for the delivery manager. And immediately, it shifted. The fact that I wasn't fully forthcoming but then sort of came clean, made the entire room feel better about everything. And they immediately sort of changed their attitude. But if I hadn't said, look, I'm completely powerless in this situation. This isn't me just giving you an arbitrary deadline because I want to be a tyrant. This is a help that we're giving to the delivery manager. And I don't have any power in this situation. They would have just been resentful for, I'm sure, the next few weeks. And it was like everybody suddenly breathed. Daniel Coyle, again in the Culture Code, was looking at high-achieving teams like the Navy SEALs, Pixar, and the Upright Citizens Brigade, which is a comedy troupe. They all had rituals that exposed vulnerability. So the Justin takeaway for this one is just admit that you're vulnerable. It actually isn't that bad, and it'll help people connect with you. Number 3, say what you mean and mean what you say. Another thing, again, going back to oftentimes developers don't seem to feel like they have a voice in things. I was in the middle of an interview group with a couple developers who were interviewing somebody that they would line manage them. And afterwards, the hiring manager came around and said, what do you think about him? And the developer said, oh, yeah, he was fine, he was great. And after she left, one of them turned to me and said, actually, he was terrible. I think he's full of shit. I think he's going to be, he's absolutely not what was going to fit in here. And I think it's a bad idea to get him. And I looked at him, I just said, wait, but why didn't you tell her that? And he just said, oh, I'm in my 6-month probation period and I don't think I should say anything bad about people. And I looked at him, I just said, but he's going to line manage you. You don't trust him and you think he's full of shit. And she asked you for your opinion and you lied to her. And he said, oh, well, my opinion doesn't really matter anyway. And I said, she asked you for your opinion for a reason. Like you do have a voice in this. You have to admit that. And he hemmed and hawed for maybe 5 or 10 minutes. That's the opposite of agile, when we're being forthcoming, we're being transparent. It's the opposite of that. We need you to say what you mean and we need you to mean what you say. If you're not telling us the truth, nobody's served by that. The guy didn't get hired anyway, but it was one of the most frustrating experiences that I've had. So if you're talking to people, communicating with them, just make sure that you say what you mean and mean what you say. Say just enough. This is not just related to developers. I'm sure we all run into people who are really long-winded like I'm being right now. And they all, at the same time, they obscure what they're trying to say. And that is one of the worst things you can do in a meeting. I've actually been on conference calls where people were asked to leave because they just said nothing for 5 minutes. But they were talking quite a bit. Please, the takeaway from this, just say what you need to say. Say it clearly, and then don't try to say any more or obfuscate whatever your point is. If there's a way you can summarize emails in a single line instead of 8 paragraphs, just do that. We need you to say what's wrong. This came up also at a previous job. We had quite a few meetings where people wouldn't actually tell the business what was going wrong with the business. Even though it was tanking, they went from 70 developers to 12. They had no product people left. Nobody was willing to tell the business exactly what the problem was. And so the business had no idea what was going on. We depend on people to tell us what's wrong. And if nobody's willing to do that, there's a bigger, that's a really big problem that you can solve. luckily, my accent gives me away, obviously. There's stereotypes that Americans have of being loudmouthed and, what's the word, bullshy. I was able to take that role on in certain instances and just I was able to say, look, this is what I think the problem is. But it would have been much easier and it would have been more effective if the people that were at the center of that had taken the responsibility and told the business what the problems were. So if you're a developer and you know something's wrong, this is the Justin takeaway, flag it up to the system. We also need you to tell us what's right. And this is a little bit different. Flickr, how many know of Flickr? How many know it started as a game company? Okay, so a few of us. Flickr was a game company. They were building tools for a particular video game. I don't know which one it was. James, do you remember? It was, nobody does. But it was a gaming company, and they were building tools, and they realized that everybody was using their site to share photos. They were using the site wrong. So Flickr decided, wait a second, if nobody's buying the services that we're actually selling, but they're buying this other service that we're not selling, shouldn't we be selling that service? And they turned into a photo sharing site and sold to Yahoo for however many billions of dollars. What's right? What you think is wrong or what the business thinks is wrong? The business might have looked at it and said, look, we need to figure out a way to stop people from sharing photos on our site because this is not the way this is not our business. What developers and data people have the unique ability to do oftentimes is step back and say, you know what? No, something's right here, and we need to pursue that. And Rachel mentioned the lean startup. That's something that comes up quite a bit. It was Eric Ries who wrote that, and that comes up quite a bit. Look to see what's right, and then see if that's something that can be exploited, because even in a giant company, you can practice, it's intrapreneurship, I believe is the term that he uses. You can practice intrapreneurship and change the valuation and the future of a company. So the Justin takeaway from this one is to find a failure, see if it's a success, and see if it's a success. If you find a bug, call it a feature. We need you to document problems, and I'm going to be a turncoat against the product people. For the people that are developers, raise your hand if you've experienced this situation. The business or product people will come to you, you'll flag up a problem or a bug. And then the business or product people come back and say, we're not going to fix that right now. Put it in the backlog, we'll deal with it at some point. Has that happened? Okay. Yes. Make sure you document that, because if something goes wrong and they come back to you and say, why didn't you tell us about this? You can go back and cover your own ass about that. Do it in clear, unambiguous terms also. Don't be too wishy-washy about it. Tell us why we're wrong. Openness and transparency in saying what you mean, all those issues. We're in tech and we rely on transparency. I know a lot of people in here try to be very polite, but if you're overly polite, I was shown today a flow chart of what British people say, what they mean, and what other people hear. So things like, that's very interesting, means it's absolutely uninteresting. And I'll hear, oh, Rachel was actually pretty interested in that. I should send her a LinkedIn message about that. We need to know why we're actually wrong in clear, unambiguous language, especially if you're working with an international group like a lot of you will be. And for high-achieving teams, again, in the culture code, Daniel Coyle studied cultures. Honestly and openly discussing things, especially problems, is a hallmark of almost every high-achieving culture and every high-achieving company. One of the things that Google did in the early, who's heard of AdWords? It's like, I think it makes 100 million a day or something like that for Google. It's obscenely successful. That came from one of the founders walking into the kitchen with printouts of a bunch of advertisements that Google had run and a note that just said, these are terrible. Like, wasn't messing around. He should clearly, these are terrible, do something to fix them. And an engineer walked in, saw it, spent 2 evenings of his time, personal time, fixing the problems, went to sleep, presented them, and now Google is where it is now. But if he'd walked in and said, these could be improved, everybody would have just said, oh, well, they could be, but what are we supposed to do? We have plenty of other things to think about. So if you're lucky enough to work in a place with things like daily stand-ups, bring something up tomorrow to discuss that's wrong. We need you to tell us how things work in normal, plain language. I know. As a product owner, I can only do so much to explain things to the business side because they speak a completely different language also. But what we need from you as developers, and we'll ask you over and over and over again, a good one will, to explain things so that they actually understand. A great example of this came up earlier today. We were trying to communicate an issue to someone higher up, and it just wasn't getting through. And finally, one of the testers said, it's like if you take a house, lift it up, remove its foundation, put a new foundation down, and then put the house down and hope that it stays standing. And they said, oh, that's what it's like. And immediately it was like, well, we could have just done that instead of tried to explain it for the last 10 minutes. If you can draw analogies, that's really great. But we need you really to explain to us how things work because, and plain English, because it's oftentimes just far too difficult for us to understand. And how you can do it. This came up a few months ago. I got an email talking about how a development team wasn't going to be able to do something. Oh, let's see if, and we went back and forth for probably half a day. And finally, I got this idea in my mind because it was not going to happen. They weren't going to do it. They couldn't do it. And I emailed back and I said, is this absolutely impossible? If so, that's the answer. We can't tell the business that it's possible because it isn't. And the developer said, no, it might be possible. And so I said, okay, so when I go to the business, do I tell them it's impossible or possible? They said, oh, no, it's probably possible. I said, well, so you can do it. It's not that you can't. And the developer said, well, yeah. And I said, okay, so if you have a problem, figure out how if it can be done. If it can't, understood. It's impossible. You can't. I'm trying to think of an analogy and I can't. If you can't do it, you can't. What's that? Schrodinger's cat. But if you can do it, figure out how it can be done and then come to us and we'll be able to see if there's time or funding available for it. Tell us what problems things solve. If everybody here, if you're working in a business, hopefully, again, you're solving a problem that people have and are willing to pay money for it, and you can solve it for less money. What is it? You can solve it for less money than they're willing to pay. Those are the two hypotheses that Reese and Blank came up with. Facebook solves communication and community problems. Newsfeed Eradicator solves the attention problem that Facebook creates. If you have Newsfeed Eradicator, it's amazing. Everybody here can solve problems, is working on things that can solve problems. So explain to us, not only in product, but also throughout the real world, how your product solves problems, because more than likely people will buy it if it can solve one of their problems. And the last thing, number 12, what you need from us. This goes to a problem with product owners and businesses generally. We oftentimes hope you'll just tell us what you need, if you need anything, or what can be unblocked if something needs to be unblocked. So we depend on that communication to us for us to actually help you as well. If your product owner or whoever's in business doesn't ask you, just tell them. And the Justin takeaway for this one is to ask your product owner for help. I came up with a bonus one as well, and I've been waiting. This was like right before I left work. I've been waiting to do this for years, and this is the first time I've actually had the opportunity to do so. So PowerPoint's a fact of life in most organizations, but it doesn't need to be. I actually have a friend named Nate Nanzer who's now commissioner of the Overwatch League in America. They've raised something like $600 million in the last year to sell teams and franchises. I was having dinner with him a few years ago, and I asked him what explained his success. He said, "I'm really, really good at giving PowerPoint presentations." One of the things about PowerPoint is that it's only good if you use minimal words or pictures. Putting too much text on a slide can destroy it, so please don't. And there's something, again, just things to do. After this, one of the things I was thinking was, as this is a community, make sure you talk to each other, listen to each other, figure out ways to help each other and support each other. Talk to others, don't get siloed, and meet people who are not in tech. Help share the story of the Scottish technology system and the ecosystem that exists here. Volunteer to speak at events like this. Please do the 5-minute talks next month because it's a really good opportunity to share your ideas, whatever they are. And the reason to do that, we'll succeed as a business community if we actually communicate. And if we hold ourselves to a higher standard of communication, we'll all succeed. So that's it. Thanks a lot. And if there are any questions, Rachel's willing to come up here as well. So, oh, cool. I'm happy with none. Andrew Samtoy. Who asked that? Sorry. Oh, yeah, Andrew Samtoy. Cool. Yeah. Cool. Rachel? I think it might come down to a definition, and it might be the ourselves. I don't know. My thought is it might be the ourselves word, and it also goes back to sort of one of the things that you alluded to, and it goes to Stephen Covey's circles of influence and circles of concern. We all have circles of influence, except for people like Paris Hilton. Where our circle of influence is say, it's a circle as large as this microphone. What we're concerned about is probably larger. Paris Hilton has a circle of influence that's probably this big, or who's the Jenner, Kardashian, Kim Kardashian. Circle of influence is even bigger than Paris Hilton's right now. She's probably concerned about this much compared to what she could actually influence. We can only influence, say, ourselves. Well, you can't, as tech people, you can't say, hey, product people, you need to come over to us. So what you can actually influence, if it is yourselves, is to go to the product meetup, or to go to the management meetup, or the finance meetup, and go and talk to those people yourselves, if, depending on what the goal is. If it's cross-pollination of ideas, you need to go and share your ideas and also listen to the ideas of others, I think. And maybe it is, there's possibly, the tech meetup could invite speakers from the product meetup, or the finance meetup, or the entrepreneur meetup, or things like that. But I think, I guess maybe it goes to what's the goal of, what do you see as the end of this? And so you need more communication, interaction. What do you need from that? Mm-hmm.
Black box where they're just causing you problems rather than see it as you trying to solve problems together. It's partly if you know people, you tend to see them more as individuals with problems
Mm-hmm.
rather than just sort of abstractions.
Sure, sure. But again, I guess, is it empathy? Is empathy the end, or is it a culture that I don't know, achieves entrepreneurship or spins out startups at? So how do we turn ourselves into lions? Oh, okay, yeah, absolutely. So, but it's a good question. There was another question in the back, though. Okay, great.
Cool. Thank you very much, Andrew. So this concludes another tech meetup. I'd like again to thank our sponsors, Skyscanner, Cultivate, and Informatics Ventures. What we're going to do now is go to the Blue Blazer, which is like if you take a left as we go out the building, it's just at the end of the street.